In 1973, Mary and I were moving from Massachusetts to Oregon, and on our cross-country trip, no, I just gotta get over the emotion. On our cross-country trip, we stopped at Keetley. We saw the old gray weathered houses, and she told me the story. We are here today to remember what began in Keetley, March 1942, 80 years ago. We are here to celebrate the courage, the sacrifice, the very, very hard work the evacuees gave to make Keetley Farm a success. We are here to celebrate the bravery of the people who chose to leave the West Coast on their own during a 38-day period that the government allowed self-evacuation. Now, why 38 days? There were 38 days between the signing of Executive Order 9066 and the military authorities on the West Coast issuing Public Proclamation number 4, which declared that all self-evacuation would stop, would not be allowed after March 29th, 1942. So that makes 38 days. After March 29th, all people of Japanese ancestry that were still in West Coast states were ordered to stay in place and wait to be sent to camps. So the people who self-evacuated Keetley had to accomplish the following within 38 days in order to leave the West Coast as free people. As you know, 38 days can pass quickly. In just 38 days, they had to decide whether to self-evacuate. Not an easy decision. Consider the unknowns they faced, the uncertainties, the difficulties of deciding. They had to find a place inland to evacuate to that would accept Japanese Americans and a place that would provide, a means for self-support financially. They had to transport or ship necessary possessions, clothing, cooking equipment, essential farm equipment, tractors, implements, hand tools needed to run a farm. Finally, they had to physically leave the West Coast states by the deadline, midnight, March 29th, 1942, and travel to the new location. Can you imagine the uncertainty, the fear, the anxiety, and how they wondered, how will we be treated in Utah? Will we be able to survive the hardship and financially sustain ourselves there? So imagine yourself in that situation. We all came here, we came from our wonderful homes, we came from, we had all our possessions and everything. Imagine not being able to go back, that you've abandoned your house, that you've abandoned your possessions, that you came here with whatever you could carry in your car. Imagine that situation. Okay, so what was Keetley like before 1942? There was mining nearby. The Pony Express passed through Keetley between 1860 and 1861. One Pony Express rider was Jack Keetley, for which the town was named. So during the silver mining boom of the 1920s, George Fisher filled the area with buildings that housed up to 600 miners. He leased the rest of the land for a schoolhouse, a store, an amusement hall called the Blue Goose, and the Blue Goose hosted boxing matches, dance nights, and had pool tables, a marble top bar, and during Prohibition, a bootlegging operation. But when the Great Depression happened, all the mining pretty much shut down, so Keetley became a ghost town. So why did the self-evacuees settle in Keetley? What happened? What's the story? There are many events that lead to Keetley. In Oakland, Fred Wada operated many produce markets, and after Pearl Harbor there was much anti-Japanese sentiment, and his markets were boycotted. He realized there was no future for his produce business and his family in Oakland, but he did not want to be sent to an internment camp. And he did not want to become dependent upon the government for support. Sometime in February 1942, he decided to travel to Utah to seek a place to evacuate his family and possibly open a business there. He had heard there was a labor shortage there, and his wife, Masako, was born in Utah, and she spoke to him about the kindness of the Mormons. Fred Wada met with the Utah Governor Herbert Ma to seek permission to evacuate to Keetley with his family, to avoid being locked up in an internment camp. Governor Ma told him that he had to meet with counties that were willing to allow Japanese Americans to settle in their counties. There were 29 counties in Utah at that time, and still probably are. There were only 2 willing to meet with Mr. Wada and discuss possible settlement. They were Deschutes County and Wasatch counties. While in Salt Lake City, he also met with David Trevithick, who was the head of the Utah Department of Public Welfare. Trevithick told Wada about George Fisher, who had been involved in Utah state government, but was now living in Keetley, where he had a ranch. The ranch buildings were used for homes in the past by miners while the silver mine was active. So while in Salt Lake City, Wada met by chance with Frank Endo and Roy Tachiki at the U.S. Cafe, owned by the Tsuyuki family. Frank Endo and Roy Tachiki represented their extended families who also were trying to self-evacuate to Utah. The 3 of them decided to travel together to Roosevelt, the county seat of Deschutes County. The Tsuyuki family offered their family car and John Aoki to drive the 3 men to Roosevelt. A meeting of county officials and others had been scheduled to be held in Roosevelt to discuss possible settlement of Japanese Americans. There was a labor shortage in that county because local men had enlisted for military service or had gone to the West Coast to work in industries to earn higher wages. So the local farmers needed laborers to complete various seasonal work. Keetley was located about 40 miles east of Salt Lake City and on the route to Roosevelt. Wada, on the advice of Trevithick, decided to stop at Keetley and speak with George Fisher. The 3 men saw the vacant housing available on Fisher's land, and Fisher said the land was productive. However, at that time in March, the land was under snow at the time, and so it was impossible to tell how productive the soil might be. They continued on to Roosevelt for the meeting. Fred Wada, Frank Endo, and Roy Tachiki to meet with over 350 people in Roosevelt. There was a mixed response from the crowd about whether Japanese Americans should be allowed to settle there. Some people had lost relatives at Pearl Harbor, but others needed laborers to help with agriculture work. But the overall response appeared to be favorable to allow the evacuees to settle in Deschutes County. But a very important consideration was that Roosevelt was over 140 miles from Salt Lake City, which would be an important market for selling produce. And Roosevelt did not have a railroad line. So after the meeting, the 3 men went to eat at a local restaurant. They had paid in advance for motel rooms for the night, but they were harassed and felt threatened at the restaurant and left the town without getting a refund for the motel rooms. That fearful experience convinced the 3 men that Roosevelt in Deschutes County was not the place they wanted to move their families to. Wasatch County, where Keetley was located, was the other county willing to consider having the evacuees settled. Keetley was only 40 miles to Salt Lake City, and there was a railroad line, which would provide a means to ship produce raised by the farm to Salt Lake City. Plus, the railroad line would be a means to ship needed farm equipment and other possessions to Keetley from the West Coast. So further discussions were held between Fred Wada and George Fisher. Wada invited Fisher to visit with Japanese American families in San Jose, Los Angeles, Lompoc, and Oakland to get acquainted and help him decide if he could support their move to Keetley. George Fisher would need to reassure Governor Ma that the evacuees to Keetley would be good citizens and would support themselves financially. Finally, Fisher agreed to lease the land to Wada, and Fred Wada paid George Fisher $7,500 from his own personal money for the first year of the lease. The lease provided the evacuees use of the land for farming and all the existing buildings of the property for housing, plus other buildings for livestock and storage. I would like to read parts of a July 10th newspaper article from the Ogden Standard Examiner. This article came out just 3 months. 3 months after the evacuees had settled in Keetley, and I think this article, only 3 months after the people settled here, reflects an improving attitude toward the evacuees. New home for Japanese thriving in Utah area. 90 Japanese American evacuees are carving a new agriculture community out of rolling sagebrush land at this mountain crossroads. These transplanted farmers and businessmen aren't receiving a cent of financial subsidy from the federal government or from any outside source. They have stated their respective futures on their own hard work. American Fair Play and 3,800 acres of largely virgin valley land owned by George Fisher. Most of the 90 live in weather-beaten 3-story boarding house left over from Keetley's bright era when there was mining. Others have taken deserted dwellings of smaller size. Clearing the land is a back-breaking job. The men ranging in age from 17 to more than 70 are in the fields from sunrise to after dark, 16 to 18 hours on many days. Later in the article, Fred Wada is quoted by the newspaper. Fred Wada, who used to operate a chain of produce markets in Oakland, is the colony's leader. He hopes for the best, but isn't making any rosy predictions until the colony has had a longer trial. We're going to do our best, he says, but if we make it this year at all, there won't be anything left over for profit. Next year should be easier. While the men work and the women and children care for pigs, chickens, and occasional goat that are kept in well-worn ranch barns. Wada has organized a Boy Scout troop among the youngsters. There is a young men's basketball team which plays with nearby high schools. Next year, the colony children will attend regular schools. Soon after the people had arrived in Keetley, there were several incidents of dynamite explosions late at night near the new colony. No one was injured. The local sheriff investigated. The sheriff thought that it was simply someone having fun. Others thought it was due to resentment for the settlement of the evacuees. The sheriff posted a guard for a while, but no further explosions occurred. After Governor Ma learned of the dynamite explosions, he sent a letter to Fred Wada telling him to take his Japanese colony back to California. But my father-in-law, being the person he was, he told his wife and then ignored me because no one could return to California. Later on, after a very successful harvest at Keetley Farm, Fred Wada sent Governor Ma a large box of their finest beets, lettuce, peas, turnips, and onions. And the governor replied in a letter dated July 30th, only 3 months or 4 months of growing season here, and praised the Japanese colony. You are proving by your work that you are loyal, high-class citizens. Keetley Farm eventually became known as the most successful mountain farm in Utah. So let us remember the courage, the bravery of the evacuees. They were willing to risk everything, their futures, their savings, and to work very, very hard to create a successful farm at 6,000 feet elevation. And they were free.